Greetings! My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for DMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
As we step once more into a brand new year, I'm sure many of you Dungeon Masters out there are thinking about what campaigns you want to start running with friends, new and old. Perhaps many of you are jumping in for the first time and planning your own homebrew campaign, or perhaps some of you are looking down the barrel of a very busy year and thinking, I want to get my gaming on, but I'm going to have to run a module this time around.
Since the launch of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, Wizards of the Coast has launched over a dozen campaign modules for everybody to run at their tables. These campaigns range in their different themes, storylines, difficulty, and appeal. So as you set out trying to decide what campaign module is going to be right for you, hopefully Monty and I can help you out on that journey.
This is part 1 of our rankings for the official modules for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Now, rather than giving these an S tier or A tier ranking, we're going to use a little bit more nuanced criteria to help you decide which of these modules might be a good place for you to start. At the end of the day, I do feel that as a Dungeon Master, it is worth your time to read through a little bit of these modules, assess for yourself as a Dungeon Master and for the players that you're playing with to ultimately make the final decision. But hopefully some of the criteria that we have today will help you decide which ones that are worth looking at and which ones are considering, and which ones probably aren't worth your time.
There's a lot to talk about today, so let's get rolling. So in this video today, we're actually going to be looking at half of the modules as there are so many to go over. In a subsequent video, we are going to cover the other half so that you can look over and hear our thoughts on every campaign that has been released so far. As we get into our look at all of these different modules, we're going to be pretty fast-paced in this, but we do want to cover a brief synopsis of what the campaign is about. We also want to look at what level of DM we think that this campaign is appropriate for. What is the DM workload? Meaning, is there a lot that you need to either remember or possibly change from the book itself? We also are going to look at the player challenge. Is this meant for newer players, or will it require some experienced players who might still have trouble surviving the campaign? And finally, we're going to look at the appeal of this. Who's going to most enjoy this type of campaign?
So up on screen first, you're going to see how we assess our criteria for the recommended experience level for each DM. We've broken this into 4 levels: novice, beginner, intermediate, and expert.
Also on screen right now, you'll see the amount of DM workload and the ranking we're using for that. Again, this has to do with how much needs to change on behalf of the DM, how much effort they might need to put into remembering or finessing certain parts of the book. This ranges from low, average, high, or a true fixer-upper.
We felt it was important to distinguish between the DM's skill level required and the amount of work for the Dungeon Master, as we feel that some modules require a very experienced DM, but if you are experienced enough to run them, it's not a lot of work, and sometimes vice versa. Some of these modules aren't too difficult to run, they just might require a lot more work from you to bring them to the table.
And finally, for the players out there, we rank it from easy, medium, or hard. This is meant to determine whether or not new players can jump in and have a pretty relaxing experience playing D&D, or if you're looking at a module that is going to be much more demanding on your players, whether that's the choices they have to make, the situations they find themselves in, or the level of combat encounters that they have to engage with.
With all that in mind, strap yourselves in. Here we go. We're going to go through all the modules that have come out to date as of January 2022 for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in chronological order.
All right, so kicking things off with the Lost Mines of Phandelver. This was the module introduced in the starter set for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and was the first module released. This module is for characters level 1 to 5, meaning that it's a much more compact narrative than a lot of the other modules out there. This module has a classic premise. The characters arrive in the town of Phandelver and are on the hunt for a lost mine that can produce magic items. Along the way, the characters are going to deal with goblins and bugbears, possibly a dragon, while dealing with bandits in town, a evil mage, well on the hunt for this mystical lost mine.
As the first module released for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, this module is by far and away the best for a first-time Dungeon Master in our estimation. The opening dungeon of this module is really simple to run right out of the book, and both in terms of... And so this is one that you can really read through and be ready to run the game that night. It is the perfect introduction for a new Dungeon Master.
In terms of the DM workload, extremely low. Again, great for jumping into. You can run it right off the page. You don't need much else in terms of that.
The DM workload is so low for this module that oftentimes many new Dungeon Masters use this as an excuse to go above and beyond with preparation for the game. And I've seen many first-time Dungeon Masters go ahead with painting miniatures and building terrain to really show off to their players how great D&D can be. So if you do want to build on top of this module, you can, but you really don't have to.
And for player challenge, it's pretty easy as well. Great for brand new players who are just jumping into the games of Dungeons and Dragons for the first time.
Although there are a couple dicey encounters with a dragon involved.
Now, when it comes to the appeal of this, I think that this is the classic D&D trope. You get to deal with all of the fixings that you imagine you might find in a D&D campaign. It's a pretty short campaign and will only take you between 8 and 10 sessions to finish, but I think that if you are a new DM or jumping in with brand new players, even if you're an experienced DM but you have a group of players who are just experiencing D&D for the first time, this is such a great jump-off point. Although there's nothing here to really say this will appeal to a certain type of person, I think this is pretty standard and basic and well-rounded. I think really this appeals to anybody who likes D&D.
I wholly agree. If you are a first-time Dungeon Master, this is perfect. If you are bringing new players into the game of Dungeons & Dragons, you probably can't do better than this module.
Moving on to the first major release for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, we are looking at both Hoard of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat. Hoard of the Dragon Queen was designed for characters level 1 to 8, where Rise of Tiamat is from 8 to 15. Together, these are the Tyranny of Dragons and create one consistent module that goes all the way from level 1 to 15. For that purposes, we will be reviewing it as a whole. This was my first module that I ran as a DM after Lost Mines of Phandelver, and I had a lot of fun with it. This campaign sees your players pitted against the evil cult of dragons who are working on a devious scheme to raise Tiamat from the 9 hells. Along the way, they have to save some villages from the evil cult, uncover the secret plots of the cult of dragons, travel with a caravan trying to uncover who some dragon cultists might be amongst them, and work with a group of factions to dismantle the plots of the cult of dragons before the rise of Tiamat comes to term.
This module was designed with beginner Dungeon Masters in mind. That is a Dungeon Master who had, like Kelly, come from running Lost Mines of Phandelver and going on into this module. And in fact, there's a lot of adaptations that link the two modules together quite well, so you can actually go right from one to the other too. One of the things that you will find with this module is that it does grow in increasing complexity as the adventure progresses. But since you'll be gaining new skills as a Dungeon Master, this is a really good way to raise your proficiency and ease into running more complex encounters in your games of D&D.
Now, when it comes to DM workload, we actually rank this one as average. The main reason for that is a lot of this campaign was written while the rules for 5th edition were still being developed. There are many people who have sounded off on the fact that some of the encounter balance is a little out of whack here. There are instances, for example, where your players end up at a relatively low level facing off against several assassins assassins, which I think at the time of the publication, assassins weren't as dangerous as they became. So that turns into an extremely deadly encounter if you're not careful. Because of that, there is a little bit of finessing required by the DM, but the locations presented, the villains represented are still really great. There is room here to explore your homebrew and fleshing things out a bit more, and I actually had a lot of fun bringing some of the villains to life in new and meaningful ways, with little side adventures that were added in because my players grew attached to certain NPCs.
The workload can accelerate, though, a little bit out of control if you start looking for all of the expanded content that has been developed for this module. Because it is one of the oldest modules and so many people have run it, there's a ton of extra stuff that has been created by other DMs, and so it is easy to artificially inflate the workload of this module. Overall, it's not too difficult for players, aside from the fact that it does present monsters of a much higher challenge rating than what the players are capable of facing head-on. I personally think that the module does a relatively decent job of moderating this, at least early on, although there is an adult dragon in the very beginning of the module. So there's instances where the players have to face a much harder encounter than they might otherwise expect.
For the appeal of this campaign, I think that this campaign is great for people who want a bit of classic D&D. Fighting against a cult is pretty standard. A cult of dragons, well, the game's called Dungeons and Dragons, so putting your players up against a bunch of dragons that they have to fight, as well as the threat of rising the queen of all dragons, that seems really on brand with what a lot of newcomers to D&D are going to want to experience. On top of that, the module includes various ways to engage with it in a combat sense, but also a lot of opportunities for great role-playing, social encounters, and exploration. Because of that, this actually works really well with a group who just wants to fight the cult. Also works really well for a group that wants to sneak in and infiltrate and uncover the mystery of the cult. So there's a lot of leniency with the type of group that can engage with this plot.
That said, it is a little bit of a linear campaign, and it does have some moments that really do rely on the players doing the thing that the module expects them to do. But in the end, they do get to fight a dragon god. So in that respect, it is a pretty classic D&D experience that I think is really great, again, if you have a relatively new group to Dungeons & Dragons. The next released campaign for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition was Princes of the Apocalypse, which continues along our theme of battling evil elemental cultists intent on destroying the world. This time, however, the cultists worship evil elemental princes from the 4 different planes of earth, air, water, and fire. This adventure sees the players battling against the cult by driving them out of their hideout, which is actually a mega dungeon. So the players will be able to explore different elemental themed wings of one large interconnected dungeon as they work to dismantle and fundamentally destroy the cultists and defeat their aims. What's interesting about this module is that it actually changes dynamically depending on what order the player characters attack the cultists in. And so you can actually end up with one of 4 different final boss encounters in the adventure.
Because a lot of this campaign is a dungeon crawl, it is actually great for beginner DMs. Everything that's presented in the book is pretty easy to run, and the campaign is pretty straightforward. And so a dungeon master who's maybe ran 1 or 2 previous campaigns is going to have no problems here.
Unfortunately, most of the dungeons are relatively contained. Even though they do interconnect with one another, the connections are very clearly delineated, and the dungeons are not what I would necessarily consider sprawling. They're actually kind of linear in the way that they're put together. So there's not a lot of extra work that you have to do as a dungeon master. Again, like Rise of Tiamat, this is one of those adventures where you can look at all the extra information that has been created for the adventure online and build it out if you want to. But I do think that a lot of the adventure sites can be run by the book.
This campaign poses a moderate challenge for player characters. If they're brand new to the game, there might be some challenging instances here, But for the most part, the moderate challenge is going to be relatively easy for experienced players and a decent enough challenge for new or middle of the range players.
Yeah, there's no real nasty death traps in any of this dungeon, and there's nothing that's really going to throw the players for a loop overall in the structure of the adventure. And in general, in that respect, this adventure is best for a sort of beer and pretzels game where the focus really is on getting together with your friends, rolling some dice, and fighting some monsters. There's not a lot of complexity to the plot or the themes involved. It's really just kicking in the door on the dungeon and beating up some crazy cultists. Well, there are opportunities for some interesting role-playing encounters, particularly in the earlier parts of the module, where before the players have discovered that the cultists' hideouts are actually part of this interconnected dungeon. I think that melts away pretty quickly, and ultimately this module is going to be a straight up kick in the door style dungeon crawl with some interesting but rather bog standard environments. So I think that this is good for like a low stress classic D&D experience that is going to be relatively well contained.
The next release is Out of the Abyss. In this module, we travel into the Underdark. Or more specifically, your players were captured and are imprisoned in the Underdark by the Drow. And the campaign sees them not only escape from this imprisonment and try to find their way to the surface, all the while uncovering a mysterious plot involving the rise of demonic presence in the Underdark. And by the time they eventually do get to the surface, they need to decide whether or not they are willing to go back down and face the demonic presence head on. The campaign builds to a stunning conclusion with some of the most infamous demon lords in all of D&D history. And one of the fun things is that you as a DM get to kind of pick and choose which final boss they're going to encounter. This is the first campaign module that we actually recommend for an intermediate Dungeon Master level, meaning that you should have a bit of experience running campaigns first before you get into this one. The main reason for that is that, first of all, starting off with a prison break is actually a really dangerous situation. There's a lot of potential for player death right off the beginning, and as they traverse the Underdark, there are major threats, as well as something that is represented as a open campaign, but actually benefits from a more linear approach. And so the Dungeon Master needs to keep a lot in mind, weigh in on very deadly encounters, and manage the expectations of their party, and try not to murder them outright.
In respect to the Dungeon Master workload, one of the hardest things about running Out of the Abyss is that the first part of the campaign after the escape from Vecnavelv is actually rather disorganized. And the book is a little bit challenging to parse out the exact structure of the adventure. Because of this, it does make for a little bit of extra work in that you really do need to read the entire book pretty thoroughly to grok what is actually happening in this adventure. Because the book does a very poor job of spelling it out for you.
The book has an entire section on side missions that you can pepper in during exploration. However, the exploration components happen between almost every chapter in the book. Not only that, but there is one chapter in the book, chapter 4, which is extremely meaty and brings in a lot of components that may or may not be interesting to all groups. For myself, when I ran this campaign, I actually cut out majority of chapter 4 and kept in 3 of the plot points that I thought were most interesting for my group, and we had a great time. So when you are reading through this module, you're going to have to piece it together a bit like a puzzle and pull out chunks that maybe don't suit your needs. This is also moderate for the player difficulty. Although that is similar to the other campaigns we mentioned, I will say again at the very beginning, it can be pretty tough. But for a majority through most of the campaign, it's pretty standard play for Dungeons & Dragons.
There's just a handful of scenarios in this that are very, very challenging and present the players with basically situations where they need to run away. If you don't have a group that is the type to ever back down from a fight, they could get themselves in over their heads pretty easily with this adventure.
The appeal of this campaign is, for me, anybody who is excited by the Underdark. If you have a group of players who are excited about prison breaks, escaping from a dangerous environment, and being in the lonely depths of the earth, trying to escape, this is a campaign for them. It also introduces madness mechanics, evil demons, and a lot of really creepy vibes. I was able to instill a lot of horror themes into my Out of the Abyss campaign that echoed some of my favorite Lovecraftian stories. I even drew a lot of inspiration from games like Hollow Knight or Super Metroid when I was exploring what Out of the Abyss might feel like.
Now, speaking of horror and classics, the next one that we're looking at is Curse of Strahd. Curse of Strahd is a modern adaptation of the classic Castle Ravenloft adventure from earlier editions of Dungeons & Dragons. It is vastly expanded and is thus an adventure appropriate of characters from 1st to 10th level. It takes the original Castle Ravenloft home to the villainous vampire lord Strahd von Zarovich, probably Dungeons & Dragons' greatest villain of all time, and brings you into the dark fantasy world of Barovia to experience the tortured mind of Strahd von Zarovich in the lands of Ravenloft. This is absolutely an adventure for an intermediate dungeon master, but one that an experienced expert dungeon master will simply turn into probably the most memorable experiences you can have with Dungeons & Dragons. If you are an experienced DM who is looking for a villain to sink your teeth into, this is the adventure to play. It will give you the opportunity to have a masterclass in role-playing a charismatic yet monstrous villain in the form of Strahd von Zarovich, and I would certainly say that the biggest kind of bar of entry here is, are you ready to roleplay this villain? Because this is what really makes this adventure come to life.
The DM workload for this campaign is average, meaning that there could be a bit of work. You could run it straight out of the book, but the early parts of the campaign are surprisingly open-ended, and your players can get into some pretty sticky situations. There's also a lot of extra content that has been released for Curse of Strahd because it is one of the most popular campaigns for 5th edition. So if you're pulling on some of that extra content, like the entry-level Death House, which is pretty dangerous, or some of the other additional content that's come out, and depending on where your players choose to go, it might mean that you might need to be ready for a number of possible situations as a dungeon master.
The adventure does do a pretty good job of giving you a nice adventure structure. It is definitely one that you only really need to read through where your players are going to go next, and from there you can run it right out of the book. Some of the adventure locations vary in complexity. Castle Ravenloft is one of my favorite dungeons of all time, but it does require a little bit of forethought because of the maze-like structure of the dungeon itself to prepare, but it's overall not too bad. In terms of player difficulty, this is one of those ones where it's really a lot on you, how ruthless your Strahd von Zarovich is. If you want to turn this campaign into a nightmare for your player characters, you can. Because it's really up to you when Strahd shows up and how much he messes with them. And for me, the more the better. Honestly, you gotta love vampires to want to run this campaign, and you gotta love your dark, gothic, horror fantasy to want to do this. Your players have to be on board with buying into the horror and the fantasy of playing as vampire slayers. I do think that this is one of the best campaigns for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition because the exploration, role-playing, and combat opportunities are all really, really high. You can have a phenomenally balanced campaign where it feels like all of the elements of exploration, role-playing, and combat are building on top of one another rather than existing in separate silos. This is one of those modules that the more you put into it, the more you get back from it, and it really is a masterpiece in my belief.
The next release is honestly one of the other most popular titles for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and I think that this was a really good chunk of modules that we had from from Curse of Strahd into Storm King's Thunder.
In Storm King's Thunder, the Ordning, the sacred pact that determines the order and hierarchy of the giants of the Forgotten Realms, has been shattered, creating a conflict between the fire giants, frost giants, hill giants, stone giants, cloud giants, and storm giants that is fixated around the disappearance of a storm giant king. Your player characters will gradually get introduced into this conflict over the course of the adventure, which spans the entirety of the Forgotten Realms. This is very much a globe-trotting adventure, which will see your player characters going all over the world into many different environments where the different types of giants dwell, and bringing together the various pieces to solve this mystery and ultimately battle the forces responsible to it, which culminates in a climactic encounter against an ancient dragon.
The recommended experience level here is also intermediate. It is a really interesting campaign, but it is rather open-ended and at times reads more like a source book for the Forgotten Realms than an actual campaign module. So it does take an experienced DM who has ran maybe a few prior campaigns in order to piece this together, especially if you've ran something like Tyranny of Dragons, which also spans across the Forgotten Realms. You might have a clearer idea of what the Forgotten Realms feels like, what some of the locations are like, for you to be able to piece together this epic, sprawling adventure across the landscape.
Yeah, this is one of those books where it really benefits if you own another book about the Forgotten Realms, like the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, or even some of the later modules, because the Icewind Dale features quite prominently in this adventure, and so even having a copy of Icewind Dale Rime of the Frost Maiden and using it when running Storm King's Thunder is quite beneficial. So in this respect, I think Storm King's Thunder is a fixer-upper. It's one of those modules where it feels like everything in it, especially that middle chapter, is just a little bit half-baked. And it is a little bit of extra work for you to go to another book and round that back out. When you're in the adventure sites, it's pretty fine, but there is this really big middle section of the module where it kind of feels like the entire sandwich just fell out and you have to pack it back in.
This is a moderate challenge for player characters. Once again, player characters are going to frequently encounter monsters that are higher than their challenge rating, but for the most part, there's nothing here that's going to drastically put them at a TPK situation unless you as the DM decide that. I think that player characters of all experience levels can have a lot of fun with Storm King's Thunder. In terms of appeal, this module is pretty standard for D&D. It offers equal parts hack and slash, equal parts social encounters, and exploration.
Having spoken to Dungeon Masters who have run Storm King's Thunder and spoken quite highly of it, in terms of the broad appeal, there's nothing that nobody's going to hate about this campaign. There's just not a lot that generally people get excited about it.
Moving on to the first book that is a compilation in this series. So this one is a little bit different. We're talking about Tales from the Yawning Portal. There are adventures in this book that span the entire range from levels 1 all the way to level 20. But unlike the other campaign modules we've talked about, this is an assortment of adventures that you might be able to loosely string together with a plotline, but generally this is a rehashing of some of the most famous modules from previous editions. The through line here is that you are at the famous tavern of the Yawning Portal, where great stories are told from many adventurers about the great exploits that they have gone on. This book kind of advertises that either you are overhearing the stories and venturing out to experience these for yourself, or that each of these adventures is a story that you are being told at the Yawning Portal. For that sake, it's not really a solid through line, and you should kind of either choose whether you want to pick out a specific module from this book that you hope to run, or find a little bit more that you can bring to it to really solidify it as a structured campaign.
All the adventures in this book, though, are dungeons, but they are not one-shots. That is a big point of confusion that some people have with this book, specifically. All of the dungeons in this book will take anywhere from 3 to 10 sessions to get your way through. It's pretty meaty in that respect. But also in that respect, we see the skill level of these dungeons run the full gamut. The low-level dungeons in this adventure, like the Sunless Citadel and the Forge of Fury, are actually great for beginner dungeon masters, and maybe even a total novice. The Sunless Citadel is a perfect intro to running D&D. Whereas the later adventures in this series, particularly Dead and Thay and the famous Tomb of Horrors, really require an expert dungeon master who has got several campaigns under their belt before taking on. So I would basically say that the further you go in this book, the more experience you're going to want to have as a dungeon master to run that adventure.
For DM workload, if you are just grabbing one of these adventures to run for your table, then the DM workload is very low. But like with pretty much everything in this book, that varies. If you are grabbing this book and hoping to bring the elements of the Yawning Portal in, turn this into a flowing structure, and add a few of your own elements to make this a thorough campaign, then you are going to be adding a lot to your plate as a dungeon master. So depending on your goals with this book, your DM workload is going to vary quite a lot.
An experienced dungeon master can crack open this book and run any of the dungeons in it in 30 minutes, but a new dungeon master probably can't.
And with player difficulty, again, it varies. And unfortunately with this book, just everything kind of varies depending on what you're picking out. If you're running the Sunless Citadel or the Forge of Fury, this is going to be pretty easy going for players. I'm running a group of new players through the Sunless Citadel right now, and we are all having a blast. But when you go all the way up to something like the Tomb of Horrors, this is a death trap dungeon meant to murder your players. So it can be a little jarring if you're introducing a group of new players in the Sunless Citadel, and then by the end of the year, all of their characters that they've spent this whole time with are getting brutally destroyed by the Tomb of Horrors, one of the most challenging adventure sites known to Dungeons and Dragons. So with that, keep in mind which adventure you're pulling out. The earlier ones, great for a new group. The later ones, make sure that you have an experienced party. We ran Tomb of Horrors as a fun adventure for our longtime group, where we all made 3 different characters to run through it with intentions of probably losing a few people along the way.
Yeah, and in terms of this, I think that Tales of the Yawning Portal is great for an experienced group of Dungeons & Dragons players that maybe have a few people that are going to take up the Dungeon Master's mantle for the first time and want to run some pretty laid-back dungeon crawls. I think that there's a good variation in the adventures in here that again, they are dungeon crawls, so they're focused on combat, but there are still puzzles and problem solving and fun exploration to have. But definitely, if you're looking for that social role-playing level, you're not going to really find that in these adventures. Although, the Sunless Citadel has Meepo. If you have a group of D&D players who you're going into a busy time, maybe at work or school or anything else like that, as a dungeon master, you're worried about how much prep work you're going to have to do, you can crack open one of the dungeons from this and start running it for your group. Save yourself the time and the work and still have a lot of fun playing D&D. That's what I've done in the past with this stuff.
Next up, we have one of the most open-ended and deadly campaigns that has been released for 5th edition, and that is the Tomb of Annihilation. In a lot of ways, the previous book that we talked about with the Tomb of Horrors is reimagined into this book.
In Tomb of Annihilation, your player characters will go into the depths of the jungles of Chult, searching for the source of the mysterious death curse that has afflicted the entire world. The death curse prevents anyone from being raised from the dead and causes those who have been previously raised to the dead to slowly waste away until they die again. Your players will explore the undead-infested jungles filled with zombie dinosaurs, including a zombie T-Rex that throws up zombie humans that it has eaten. It's awesome and kind of metal. Your player characters are in search for a lost city where the source of the death curse has been buried in the eponymous Tomb of Annihilation, which takes its cues from the Tomb of Horrors. I wonder why. Guessing on the cover. I really enjoyed running this module when I ran it for the D&D Adventurers League. That said, the first part of this module is a jungle hex crawl, which is hard. to run. The book gives you the tools to do it, but I definitely think you want to be an intermediate to expert dungeon master to run this adventure, because there's just a lot of times when you're going to have to use your judgment as a DM and go, yeah, are we going to really roll on random tables when my players get lost for 3 hours during this game session? Or should I just send them to somewhere interesting in the jungle so we can have some fun tonight?
That being said, aside from the open-endedness, the adventure sites themselves are very well structured and can be mostly run from the book. So the DM workload here is average, with the adventure sites being straight out of the book, but what you really do need to work on is that in-between and exploration components. So as a DM, be prepared for running that appropriately for your table. Some people love random encounters and a hex crawl. Other DMs might be more comfortable picking and choosing the adventure sites and just popping them in as appropriate, running from point A to point B in a set manner.
Furthermore, there's a couple dead-end plots in Tomb of Annihilation that they kind of start and then don't go anywhere, or it's not clear where they go. And there's a lot of NPCs to juggle around of varying importance and relevance. So with the DM workload, once again, this is one of those cases where if your players care about those NPCs, you got your work cut out for you to make them relevant. And the start of the adventure is a little rocky. The initial plot hooks can be difficult to assess, and we've actually seen a lot of work on the Dungeon Masters Guild and by third-party homebrewers to get the start of the adventure smoothed in a little bit, because the default that starts of this adventure literally involves the player characters being teleported to an NPC who says, please help me. In terms of difficulty, this is a death trap. This is a hard adventure, and your players can't be raised from the dead during it.
This is a module that advertises, similar to the Tomb of Horrors, the Tomb of Annihilation is designed to kill people.
Yeah.
And be careful. When running this campaign, I actually tell my player characters to design a backup character that they are equally excited about.
Your characters will need backup characters, and when this was running in Adventures League, there was an option for player characters to run it on meat grinder mode, where death saves only succeeded on a 15 or higher.
Wow. So this is great for challenging an experienced group of players with an experienced DM who is excited to up the level of their D&D campaigns. And I think that is the appeal of this.
Yeah.
Is that this is the hard level campaigns. So you've played a few campaigns already. You're looking for something challenging, something that you can really bring to life. I think that the themes here are really cool. The dangerous jungle adventure is a theme that a lot of people can really dig into. We have a lot of survival elements. We have dinosaurs in the woods, and we have death trap dungeons. If this sounds like a fun time for you and your players, you're going to find so many great things to love about this adventure.
There are a lot of puzzles in this adventure as well, specifically in the back half of it. So players that love exploration, and specifically not problem solving, but quite literally puzzles, will enjoy this adventure, because there's a ton of them in the dungeon. The cost of failing those puzzles is you die, but there's a lot of puzzles. There are cool opportunities to use for players to use their capabilities in interesting ways, and this is one of the campaigns where a player character was actually correct to take the Dungeon Delver feat. So it really helped.
So this has been part 1 of our look at the official modules released for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about your thoughts if you've ran any of these adventures in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider becoming a patron of our show. It helps us make content like this possible. You can find out how in the links below.
And don't forget to check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which air Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more advice for Dungeon Masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.